The sun was just beginning to rise, painting streaks of gold across the horizon, as Leela stepped out onto the quiet street. Her breath fogged in the cool morning air, but her mind was clear, sharp as a blade. Today was going to be different. She felt it in her bones, not the kind of vague optimism that came with a good morning coffee, but a deep, unshakable certainty. For as long as she could remember, Leela had lived her life in constant defense. Not against war or violence, but against circumstances, expectations, and the endless stream of problems life threw at her. She was the youngest of 4 siblings, each more successful than the last, her brother a surgeon, her sister a lawyer, and her eldest brother an entrepreneur with a business empire. Meanwhile, Leela was just Leela, a freelance graphic designer scraping by, often teetering on the edge of burnout. Every phone call from her parents was a subtle reminder of her inadequacy. "You're so talented, sweetheart. Why don't you try for something bigger?" her mother would say in her gentle, guilt-laden tone. She didn't hate her family, but their expectations clung to her like a second skin, suffocating and unrelenting. And then there were her clients, demanding, indecisive, and constantly trying to haggle her already modest rates. But today, things were going to change. It had started 2 weeks ago, when Leela stumbled across an obscure self-help book in a dusty corner of the library. Its title was simple yet cryptic: *The Invincible Mind, Embrace the Unshakable You*. Normally, she would have rolled her eyes and walked past, but for some reason, she picked it up. Maybe it was the boldness of the word invincible, a word she'd never used to describe herself. The book wasn't like the usual feel-good fluff. It was raw, almost brutal in its simplicity. Page after page, it hammered home one central idea. You are invincible, not because the world stops attacking, but because you stop letting it matter. At first, it sounded like nonsense. Problems mattered, deadlines mattered. Bills and rent and people's opinions mattered. But the more she read, the more something clicked. The book wasn't telling her to ignore her responsibilities. It was telling her to stop giving them the power to control her. Imagine a storm, the book said. The storm doesn't stop being a storm just because you're caught in it. But you can choose whether to stand firm or let it sweep you away. That morning, as Leela walked to her favorite café, she felt the storm brewing, not in the sky, but in her inbox. She hadn't checked her emails yet, but she knew what awaited her: a mountain of client requests, revisions, and complaints. Normally, just the thought of it would send her into a spiral of anxiety, but not today. The café was warm and cozy, its walls lined with mismatched bookshelves and potted plants. Leela ordered her usual, a caramel latte, and found a seat by the window. She pulled out her laptop, took a deep breath, and opened her inbox. As expected, the storm was there. An email from a client demanding yet another revision to a logo she'd already redone 3 times. A passive-aggressive message from another client complaining about her slow response time. A notification from her landlord reminding her that rent was due in 3 days. Normally, her chest would tighten, her mind racing with panic. But today, she remembered the book's mantra: you are invincible because you stop letting it matter. She leaned back in her chair, sipping her latte. The storm was raging, but she was still. Instead of reacting, Leela began to prioritize the demanding client. She drafted a polite but firm email, reminding them of the agreed-upon scope of work. The passive-aggressive message. She replied calmly, explaining her current workload and offering a realistic timeline: the rent. She made a mental note to transfer funds later that evening. For the first time in years, she felt in control, not because the problems had disappeared, but because she refused to let them dictate her emotions. By noon, Leela was in her zone. She breezed through her to-do list with a focus she hadn't felt in years. When a client called to complain about a minor detail, she listened patiently, addressed their concern, and hung up without the usual knot of frustration in her stomach. It wasn't just work, either. That afternoon she got a call from her mother. "Leela, sweetheart, I was just thinking. Have you considered applying for that design agency your cousin mentioned? It might give you some stability." Normally this would have sent Leela spiraling into self-doubt, but today she smiled. "Thanks for the suggestion, Mom," she said, her tone light but assertive. "But I'm happy with what I'm doing right now." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Oh, well, if you're happy, that's what matters," her mother said, though her tone was tinged with surprise. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. Over the next few days, Leila began to notice a shift, not just in herself, but in the way the world responded to her. When she stopped reacting out of fear or frustration, people seemed to sense it. Her clients, sensing her newfound confidence, stopped pushing unreasonable demands. Her friends, who were used to her flaking on plans due to stress, were surprised when she showed up to dinner with a genuine smile. Even her siblings noticed the change. "You seem different," her sister remarked during a family gathering. "Good different or bad different?" Leela teased. "Good, definitely good. You're just calmer, like nothing phases you." Leela laughed. "Maybe I've just decided to stop letting things faze me." Of course, the world didn't stop testing her. One evening, just as she was wrapping up work, her laptop froze and crashed, taking hours of unsaved progress with it. For a moment, she felt the familiar surge of panic rising in her cheese scent. But then she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. You are invincible, not because the world stops attacking, but because you stop letting it matter. She spent the next hour troubleshooting, eventually recovering most of her work. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Another day, she found herself caught in a heated argument with a client who refused to pay her full rate. In the past, she would have caved just to avoid conflict. But this time, she stood her ground, calmly explaining her tour a mess. When the client threatened to take their business elsewhere, she simply said, "I understand. Let me know if you change your mind." 2 days later, the client returned, apologetic and willing to pay her rate. By the end of the month, Leela realized something profound. Being invincible didn't mean being perfect or immune to MS. It meant embracing the chaos of life without letting it break you. It meant standing firm in the storm, knowing that you had the strength to withstand it. She wasn't invincible because the world had stopped attacking. She was invincible because she had stopped letting it matter. And for the first time in her life, she felt truly free.